All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works, right? You send us a stack of reading and we pull out the important stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So today, we're taking a deep dive into some brand new presidential actions. Like, what do these orders actually do, practically speaking? And are there any potential constitutional issues?
Really interesting set of documents here.
Yeah.
Tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, China, plus some directives on military policy and federal collective bargaining.
Oh, wow.
We're
Yeah.
going to break down what will actually change on the ground, what's the real impact. And of course, we got to look at the legal basis for all of this.
Okay, so let's dive right in. We have three presidential actions, all dated February 1st, 2025, all dealing with the flow of illegal drugs.
Right.
One targeting the northern border with Canada, one for the southern border with Mexico, and the third one aimed at the synthetic opioid supply chain from China.
Uh-huh.
Now, all three of these point to the same legal justifications: the IEPA, the NEA, and the Trade Act of 1974.
Okay, so it's interesting how they're using these powers, right?
Right.
For both Canada and Mexico, the president declares a national emergency, building on an existing declaration that was focused on the southern border. The orders cite the ongoing influx of illicit drugs
Yeah.
and, in the case of Mexico, also the issue of illegal immigration.
Right.
And the argument is that these countries haven't done enough to address these problems.
Right.
When it comes to China, the emergency declaration focuses on their role in the fentanyl crisis. The claim is that the CCP is actually encouraging the export of these precursor chemicals.
Wow.
So you see the link they're making between these issues and a national emergency, justifying the use of economic tools like these tariffs.
Right. So the argument is about national security and public health, and the tool they're using is tariffs.
Yeah.
We're talking a 25% ad valorem duty on most products from Canada and Mexico. And for those who don't know, ad valorem means a percentage of the value of the goods,
Right.
and a 10% duty on energy coming from Canada. And for China, it's a 10% ad valorem duty on all products. These were set to go into effect pretty quickly on February 4th, 2025.
Wow. Yeah.
There are a few exceptions for goods that were already in transit.
Uh-huh.
So it seems like the president is using economic pressure to get Canada and Mexico to act on drug flows and immigration, and China on fentanyl precursors, maybe going around traditional diplomatic channels.
Yeah, it's definitely a strategy of economic leverage, trying to influence these countries.
Right.
The orders clearly state that these duties are on top of any existing tariffs.
Oh.
And here's another thing.
Hmm.
There are clauses that say if Canada or China retaliate with their own tariffs, the president can actually increase or expand these duties.
Oh, wow.
And there's a similar provision for Mexico.
Okay, so beyond just imposing these import taxes, what do these orders actually do right now? It's a big threat, but do they actually outline any specific steps Canada, Mexico, or China have to take to avoid these tariffs?
That's a really important point. While these tariffs put an immediate financial burden on importers, what these countries are actually expected to do is kind of vague. For both Canada and Mexico, the orders say that the Secretary of Homeland Security has to regularly consult with other officials
Okay.
and then advise the president if these governments have taken, quote, adequate steps to deal with these crises through, quote, cooperative enforcement actions.
Right.
And the tariffs will only be removed if the president decides enough has been done.
Hmm.
And a similar mechanism exists for China. It depends on adequate steps to alleviate the opioid crisis through cooperative actions.
I see. So it's not about specific measurable things they have to do. It's more like a judgment call by the president based on what the secretary says.
Exactly.
So we wait and see. The tariffs kick in, causing economic problems, but getting rid of them depends on whether these countries are doing enough, which isn't clearly defined.
Right. What's interesting to me is that there's no direct action required from the U.S. side in these orders other than the tariffs and these consultations.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Like, they don't mention increasing U.S. border enforcement or anything like that. They don't even define what adequate steps would be. They're basically betting that the economic pressure will be enough to get these countries to change their policies and actions.
Right.
Whether that works and how fast, we'll just have to wait and see.
So this whole approach of using tariffs in this way, it brings up the question of whether it's constitutional. I mean, using IEPA and NEA for what seem to be mainly border security and drug control issues, is that normal?
Yeah, legal scholars are definitely going to be watching this closely.
Right.
The IEPA gives the president a lot of power to regulate commerce when there's a threat to U.S. national security, foreign policy, or the economy.
Uh-huh.
But that threat has to be unusual and extraordinary and come from outside the United States.
Right.
And the NEA lets the president declare a national emergency and then use specific powers granted by law.
Hmm.
Now, IEPA has usually been used against hostile countries or in really serious economic crises, using it to put broad tariffs on frenzy nations like Canada because of border security.
Yeah.
That's not typical.
Yeah.
So it does raise questions like, is this situation really a big enough threat to justify this kind of action?
Yeah.
Did Congress intend for these powers to be used in this way? Those are open questions.
All right, moving on from these trade moves, we have a presidential memorandum dated January 31st, 2025, called Limiting Lame Duck Collective Bargaining Agreements.
Yeah.
This one cites 5 U.S.C. 7301, which is all about the president's power to set rules for the executive branch.
Okay.
So what's the main issue here? It seems like it's trying to limit the power of an outgoing administration.
You got it. This memorandum is all about collective bargaining agreements,
Yeah.
CDAs, that were finalized by the previous administration in their last 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
The argument is that these lame duck CBAs were done on purpose to cause problems for the new administration
Oh.
by locking in what they call wasteful and failing policies. They specifically mention a CBA at the Department of Education about remote work as an example.
Interesting.
The idea is that these agreements go against the democratic process and make it harder for the new president to manage the executive branch effectively.
So what does this memorandum actually do? It sounds like it's trying to stop this from happening in the future, but what about agreements that were already made?
Well, the key thing is it creates a policy that CBAs made in those last 30 days before a new president takes over won't be approved if they're supposed to stay in effect.
I see.
It also stops agencies from making new CBAs during that 30-day period if they create new obligations, change things substantially, or extend existing agreements,
Okay.
except for civil rollovers agreements that are already in place.
Right, right.
And importantly, it tells agency heads to reject any CBAs that break these rules and haven't been fully approved yet.
So the main impact is on preventing these last-minute deals from being approved, not so much about overturning ones that were already in place before the new administration came in.
Yeah.
So it might only really affect CBAs that are still waiting for final approval.
Right. The memorandum's power is in blocking new agreements.
Hmm.
Whether it actually makes a difference depends on how strictly agency heads follow these instructions.
Right.
And there's one interesting exception. CBAs that mainly cover law enforcement officers. The document itself acknowledges this could raise equal protection concerns, meaning different groups might not be treated equally under the law. They even put in a severability clause, just in case that specific exemption is found to be invalid.
Now let's talk about military policy.
Okay.
We have 2 executive orders from January 27th, 2025.
Uh-huh.
One is titled Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness, and the other is Restoring America's Fighting Force. Both rely on the president's authority as commander-in-chief.
Right.
So starting with the Excellence and Readiness Order, what's the main argument there?
This one is focused on what it calls radical gender ideology in the military. The argument is that this ideology weakens the warrior ethos, physical and mental health standards, selflessness, and unit cohesion.
I see.
It specifically says that expressing a false gender identity goes against military service.
So what concrete actions does this order require? It's laying out a philosophy, but what practical changes does it make?
It tells the Secretary of Defense to update the medical standards, that's DDI 6130.03, within 60 days,
Right.
to be in line with the goals and policies of this order.
Okay.
It also says that invented and identification-based pronoun usage has to stop within the DoD, and it wants a report on how they'll implement that.
Okay.
It also says that males and females can't share sleeping, changing, or bathroom facilities unless there's a really important operational reason.
Right.
Lastly, it instructs the Secretary of Homeland Security to issue similar guidance for the Coast Guard, and it cancels a previous executive order, EO 14004, which allowed all qualified Americans to serve.
So this order is giving a clear direction for policy changes in the military, specifically about transgender individuals. It's requiring specific updates to regulations and directives. But the actual implementation and enforcement depend on the details that the Secretaries of Defense and Homeland Security provide.
Right.
The order sets the framework, but the real impact comes from those future actions. This seems like an area ripe for constitutional challenges on equal protection grounds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Policies that treat people differently based on gender identity are going to be scrutinized. The argument that these policies are necessary for military readiness and unit cohesion will likely be weighed against principles of equality and non-discrimination in court. Okay, let's move on to the second military order, restoring America's fighting force.
Oh, okay.
This one focuses on meritocracy and getting rid of race and sex-based discrimination. It seems like it might be going in a different direction than the previous order.
This one argues that DEI programs in the military have led to race and sex preferences, which it claims hurt leadership, merit, unit cohesion, readiness, and even violate the consciences of some Americans. The core policy of this order is that the DoD and Coast Guard should operate without any preference based on race or sex.
So what specific steps does it take to make that happen? It mentions DEI offices.
It defines a DEI office in a broad way and requires that they all be abolished, along with any vestiges thereof.
Wow.
It also requires the Secretary of Defense to do an internal review and document DEI actions and instances of race and sex discrimination. Plus, it prohibits the promotion or teaching of divisive concepts, the idea that America's founding documents are racist or sexist, and gender ideology within the DoD and the armed forces.
Okay.
It even forbids hiring people to teach these theories. It wants a review of leadership, curriculum, and instructors at the service academies to make sure they're aligned with this. It requires them to teach that America and its founding documents are a force for good.
So it's about dismantling DEI structures and stopping certain viewpoints from being promoted in the military. But like the previous order, its effectiveness depends on how the DoD and DHS interpret and implement these directives. What exactly is a vestige of a DEI office? What are these prohibited concepts? Those things will need to be defined. And again, this ban on teaching certain viewpoints could raise First Amendment issues about academic freedom in military schools.
Exactly. While the stated goal of promoting equal protection by prohibiting race and sex preferences is in line with the Constitution, these specific measures, like this broad prohibition of certain ideas, could face legal challenges.
Okay, on to the last executive order, the Iron Dome for America.
Right.
It's dated January 27th, 2025, and it's all about missile defense. Sounds like a big project. What's the main goal here?
This order declares that the U.S. will deploy and maintain a next-generation missile defense shield
Wow.
to stop attacks from the air and ensure a secure second strike capability. It says that the threat from ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missiles is huge, a catastrophic threat, and that current policies aren't enough to deal with adversaries that are on par with or close to the U.S. in terms of military power.
That's a pretty bold goal.
Yeah.
So what does this order actually do right now? Are we breaking ground on new missile defense systems?
Not right away. This order is mostly about studies, plans, and reviews.
Yep.
It tells the Secretary of Defense to submit a detailed plan within 60 days.
Okay.
This plan has to cover defenses against all sorts of missiles, speeding up the deployment of space-based tracking, developing space-based interceptors, underlayer and terminal phase intercept capabilities, a custody layer, pre-launch and boost phase defeat capabilities, a secure supply chain, and non-kinetic capabilities.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It also wants a review of how the DoD is organized and what authority it has to deploy things faster.
Okay.
It needs a joint submission with the OMB on what this will all cost before the FY 2026 budget is finalized. It needs an updated threat assessment with prioritized locations for defense in cooperation with STRATCOM and NORTHCOM,
Right.
and a review of how the U.S. cooperates with allies on missile defense to increase that cooperation, improve defenses, and get U.S. capabilities to allies faster. So, lots of planning and assessment going on here.
So it's laying the foundation for a potentially massive project.
Yeah.
But the actual development and deployment of this Iron Dome for America depend on these future plans, getting the money, and technological advancements. The order itself doesn't put any new systems in place right now.
Right.
It's more of a directive to plan than an immediate deployment. Constitutionally, it's based on the president's powers as commander-in-chief and in foreign affairs. But whether this actually happens and how big it is will ultimately depend on Congress and the budget.
Right. It's a statement of intent and a call for planning, not an immediate activation of a new defense system.
All right, finally, we have a presidential proclamation also from January 27th, 2025, called the National Day of Remembrance of the 80th anniversary of the Liberation of Auschwitz. This one seems different from the others.
It is. This proclamation is about remembering the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the horrors of the Holocaust.
Right.
It mourns the victims, honors the survivors, talks about the rise of anti-Semitism again, says that such hatred has no place in a civilized society or U.S. policy, remembers the founding of Israel, and restates the commitment to Holocaust education and strong ties with Israel.
Mm.
The specific action is declaring January 27, 2025 as a National Day of Remembrance and calling on Americans to observe the day with programs, ceremonies, and prayers.
So this is mainly symbolic, a way to remember and a call for citizens to act.
Exactly.
It doesn't mandate any specific government policy changes or actions beyond the proclamation itself.
Right.
And the president definitely has the power to issue proclamations like this for ceremonial and commemorative reasons.
Yeah, it's a formal way to designate a day for the nation to reflect on a significant historical event.
Looking at all these actions together, we see a pattern emerging, which goes back to our initial questions.
Right.
A lot of these presidential orders are about stating intentions and requiring reviews and plans,
Uh-huh.
especially in areas like border security with those tariffs and the ambitious Iron Dome missile defense system. The more immediate, concrete actions are things like imposing tariffs, which have a direct economic impact, or setting new policy frameworks within the executive branch, like those affecting collective bargaining and military policy. What do you think about this pattern?
What I find striking is the difference between what they say they want to achieve
Yeah.
and the actual methods they lay out to do it.
Yeah.
With the tariffs, the immediate action is economic pressure, but the path to a resolution is kind of subjective.
Right.
And the Iron Dome is a grand vision, but the order mostly just starts a planning process.
Mhm.
It makes you wonder what in these documents will actually lead to the results they want, and where might these orders not really have a tangible impact on the ground.
And as we've talked about throughout this deep dive, the constitutional issues are always there. The president is using significant executive powers, but whether some of these actions are constitutional, particularly using trade measures for non-economic goals, and how much power the president has in areas like military policy and federal labor relations could be debated and challenged in court.
Absolutely.
It highlights the tension between the president's power and the powers of other branches of government and the rights of individuals.
This brings up an important final thought for our listeners. When you see these executive orders and proclamations, don't just focus on the headlines and the stated goals. Look deeper into what these orders actually require, the concrete steps they outline, or maybe more importantly, don't outline, and what legal basis they're using. Think about what changes are actually likely to happen both in the short term and the long term, and what big questions remain unanswered about how much power the president has and whether these strategies will work.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Be sure to join us next time when we'll be diving into a new set of listener-submitted sources.
Sounds good.
Until then, keep thinking critically, everyone.